Hello everyone. Today I'm going to show you a quick tutorial on how to create a custom connector in Power Apps that uses Graph APIs, Microsoft Graph APIs. So some context, I said a lot. I said custom connector, I said Graph APIs, but let's first understand why and what's going on here. One is why custom connector. Those who are familiar with Power Apps, you might know that Power Apps has a lot of out of band connectors. There are a lot of things available out of box to let you access your data inside your organization or any other data sources. But there could be some gaps, and there are some gaps where you want something special, something that's not available in the out of box connector, and that's where these custom connectors are very helpful. Second is, so why Microsoft Graph API? If you're not familiar with Microsoft Graph API, uh, you should definitely check it out. By the way, along with this video, I'm also publishing a Medium article. I'll put the link to that in the description below. But here is that article that I'm publishing, where I'll talk about Microsoft Graph API, and I'll also give the link. So if you have not seen that, I encourage that you definitely go check out the link. Microsoft has great documentation on what is this Microsoft Graph API. I'm just looking at this overview of Microsoft Graph. It's a very powerful set of APIs that allows you to access different cloud services data. So if you scroll down here, you'll see different services of Microsoft. For example, OneNote, of course, Office 365, Insights, Calendar, Groups, what have you. You can make use of all the data in your Power Apps, so and any app for that matter. But since we are talking about Power Apps here, you can use it in the Power Apps. Um, so very useful when it comes to using some of this data from Office 365 or OneNote or Teams or any other Microsoft cloud products. Uh, Microsoft Graph APIs are very useful, and now combine that with the custom connector. And if something is not available very well in the out of band connector, this tutorial is going to be very helpful. Um, I talked about the Medium article that I'm also publishing along with that, and I'll leave the description. One thing, it's a fun fact. I was a PM at Microsoft, and about 3 years ago, I wrote an article on a very similar topic. It's still available in the Microsoft blog site, and in my Medium article, I've given description of that. It is this article. And I used the same concept, very similar concept, and this article became very popular. It's funny that people still write to me for this article, ask me questions. So it's great, but few things have changed since then. In fact, few things have become easier in Microsoft Power Apps. So in this tutorial, I will take slightly different approach, but high-level concept and use cases are roughly the same. For example, in the article that I wrote 3 years ago, I used something called Swagger file. It's also called Open API. That file I had to kind of create, and I put the link in the previous article. But it's not easy, and people still sometimes struggle to create the Swagger file. Now Microsoft has Power Apps has a different feature that doesn't require you to create the Swagger file. Microsoft does it for you. So we'll follow that approach. So hopefully that gives you enough context on what are these different technologies that we're going to be using in this tutorial, and why they're important, in what kind of situations, in what kind of use cases you can use these concepts in your Power Apps. So what will we build today? We'll build a custom connector. We'll use one of the Graph API. So let me talk about going back to Microsoft Graph documentation. Here is the Graph documentation. It has different APIs. As you can see, you can expand on any of these, and you can see what's available there for you to make use of. The one that we will be using is for users, and this is the Graph API that we user. Again, this has many different application, and the one that we'll be using will allow us to list the users in the organization. I mentioned that Graph also has something called Graph Explorer. This is a fantastic tool written by Microsoft. So what that allows you, sometimes documentations are very dry and they look abstract, like looking at this different signature of different APIs. Go to Graph Explorer and you can see for different kinds of APIs, you can just play around. For example, this is the API that I'm going to use in my application. Just say run query and you can see what kind of response you're going to get back. I have signed in using one of my colleagues account here, and it shows me how what information is relevant for my organization. But even if you don't sign in, you can get some sample information. So I encourage that you do play around. But anyway, so this is the API that we'll be using. But you know what, the concepts that we will be covering here, it will be useful for any of the other graph API. So for example, if you want to do something on top of OneNote, and that's what I see some of my customers and colleagues doing, you can use the same concept. It's just that you have to use the specifics of that API. All right. So what are the high level steps? There are 4 high level steps, and I have outlined those 4 high level steps also in this article that I am writing. I was talking about high level steps are these 4. So what are those? Uh, One is, first you have to decide what graph API to use and play around in the Graph Explorer. We kind of briefly did that. Check out the documentation of Microsoft, play around with Microsoft Graph Explorer, and then pick, okay, so this is the API we want for my use case, and this is what that API looks like. The next step is you have to register that app in Azure Active Directory, and I'll talk more about why you have to do it. But at high level, if you register an app in Azure Active Directory, it allows you to use allows this app to use Azure Active Directory identity platform. So what that means is these graph APIs happen to be APIs that use Microsoft identity. So your Microsoft account ID, and that's why you have to register that app in this Active Directory, so that when we use it in Power Apps platform, the authentication mechanism that we're going to use will say that we want OAuth. It's a special type of authentication mechanism using Azure Active Directory authentication. These are a little bit of advanced concepts for people. So if you are a beginner in Power Apps and this is the first video you're watching, this might be too much for you, because it requires that you understand a little bit about authentication, what are these identity platform, meaning what are the APIs. So if you're a newbie in Power Apps who is not comfortable with these concepts, I recommend that you first brush up your basic concepts, and we have other videos for that. This is more for slightly more advanced developers, advanced people who want to make use of these advanced concepts in their Power Apps. So you have to create as a third step, high level step, you'll create a custom connector where you will use the app that you registered in the prior step in Azure Active Directory. Okay, so that's how you create the connector. We'll go through the details of how to do that. And the last step is you're pretty much done. You have your connector, you have tested it, but now it's time for you to use. So it should be the most simple step once you have done the heavy lifting and created the connector using the APIs that you chose to do. But just to complete the loop, just to show the complete scenario, I'll also show you how to use that connector in your Power Apps app. All right, so let's go through them one by one. First step, we briefly covered that, but just to um, show that again, go to this documentation of Microsoft. Once you have your use case in mind and scenario in mind, look at their documentation, uh, check out different services that they have, and decide what you want. Definitely, I'll recommend that look at Graph Explorer and try out these different APIs. This will give you very good idea of what kind of request you have to pass, what kind of headers you get in the request and response. Here's the preview of the response, what is the header. In fact, some of these information will be very useful when we when we create the connector in Power Apps, because they will ask you for some sample for request body, header, response, and response header. So for this tutorial, we're just using this API. So I have already decided that for my use case, because I want to list all the users in my organization. So with that, we're pretty much done with this step. Let's look at the next step. Register an app in Azure Active Directory and authorize it to use Graph API. So how to do that? So this is an Azure Active Directory. So you have to go to Azure portal. Here's my Azure portal. You'll see different services here. I'm going to use Azure Active Directory. That's where you have to register your app. And I say app, it's not an app that you're creating. It's like way of saying that these APIs or whatever you have is allowed to use uh, Microsoft Azure Active Directory resources. So this is your Active Directory of, it's called Azure Active Directory. Sometimes I say Active Directory. Technically, there's also another product called Active Directory. Azure Active Directory has similar features and similar functionality, but this is not exactly the same. Uh, Going more into details of that is outside of the scope of this video, but just be aware that if you just call it Active Directory, that's not technically correct. You have to say Azure Active Directory. All right, so within Azure Active Directory, you see different options on the left nav. I'll make it slightly bigger so that we can see it clearly. You see different options in the left navigation, and I'm looking for app registration. So this is app registration is what I'm looking at. You see my cursor. I'll click on this. And you will see that there's some app that I had already registered. As preparing for this, what I have to do is click on new registration. That's how you register a new app. Give some friendly name. I'll just say graph demo. Um, what is the supported account type? In this case, I'm just going to use my own organization. That means you're allowed to use directory within my own company, which is fine, and the common one for most of the scenarios. Now the last one, although it says redirect URI is optional, but for our scenario, because we'll be using this in Power Apps as a custom connector where we'll have to ask some special privilege, we do need to provide it. So what value do you provide here? You should go back to my article, and I'll put the link here. Scroll down to the section where I have talked about this step, and I have put what do you need to say here as the redirect URI. So I'm just going to copy this here and put this back in this. All right. So with this information, I'm just going to click register. And now my app is getting registered. Uh, there's not much that I had to do here. Now notice that I also got an um, application ID or client ID. Let's copy it. I will need that in a later step. And remember that, and in my article I keep mentioning that so that you don't forget to do it. It's not a big deal if you forget this ID, but still it will be handy to, because you can always come back and get it, but still it's good practice to keep it somewhere so that you don't have to keep looking for it. So for now I'm just gonna where should I keep it? I should have opened a notepad, but let me just open this note. Okay, and let me create a new note, and I'll put this ID. Okay, and ID, just so that I don't forget. There's another thing that we will need later, and I'll come to it when we go to that step. All right, so we going back to my Azure portal, I have created an app, and I have the app ID. Next thing that I have to do is uh, grant the right permissions to this app. So we talked about, so let me tell more about what that means. Now this API is now registered. It can use Active Directory, Azure Active Directory identity platform. What permission it has, because not everybody is allowed to do whatever they want to because of security, because of security limitations. You go back to Graph Explorer or even documentation. This also tells you, if you look at modify permissions, on what kind of permissions different APIs in this category need. So for the particular API that we are using in this tutorial, I did some experiment, and I know that apart from user read, which is obvious and by default everybody gets it, because you can sign in and read your own profile, it's not a big deal. But I also need, since I'm listing all the users in the graph, I also need additional permission that allows me to read the directory. So how do I do that? I clicked on adding a permission, and there are different options here, but since we are using graph, I'm going to use graph here, and I'll click on delegated permissions, and you will see there are different options here. So different kinds of permissions for different use case. For my case, I'll just look at directory, um, and within directory I'll see directory read all. So I'm just selecting that and adding this permission. So with this, it is choosing that permission to add, but you notice that this permission, because this is slightly higher privilege, because here you're getting the list of all users, it needs something called admin consent. What that admin consent means is, like, admin of your directory, somebody who has more privilege, that person has to kind of grant you that access. So for my test case, I'm also the admin for this directory, so I'll just grant this access, say yes. Now at the end of this, both of these permissions are granted to this app. Now last thing that I'll have to do here is, I kind of alluded to it earlier, I will need to create a secret. What is that secret? It's kind of a key for this app that I am registering here. That key will allow from other places. So in this case, connector that will be creating in Power Apps environment. So we will have to pass some secrets so that we know that, hey, this application in Power Apps is allowed to call this API, and it has the right secret. So it's the authorized person, so that any random person cannot just start using my app. So I'll create a secret. Honestly, these things don't matter, so I'll just leave it as it is, but feel free to put whatever description suits you. I'm just going to use the default in 1 year. You can choose whatever works for your scenario or your organization policy. But the important part here is, whatever secret is getting created, I'm showing you my key because I know that I'm going to destroy it after the tutorial, so I don't care. But for your situation, please keep it a secret. It should really be a secret, because using this, somebody can misuse your app and start calling it from their own environment or from their own app also. So for now, I'm just going to copy uh, and put it in the same note, and this is the key I'll be using later. Now it's very important to make note of this key uh, now, because when you come back, you will not see this key again. So you can create a new secret just in case you forget it. So it's not the end of the world, but the same key that you have created, you can't see it. That's for heightened security here. So if I go back here, and I think if I come back here, I think that secret will be gone. um, so I can see it now because of caching, but I've seen that many times. When you come back, you'll see this as asterisk information, because even you are not allowed to see the key yourself when you come back, and that is for security, just in case somebody else comes and sees the secret. um, you can see that. So now that key is not available here. So it's very important that you have all these things. So with these information, I think we are done with these steps. This high level step in this category, which is register an app in Azure Active Directory and authorize it to use the Graph API. Hopefully we have not missed any step. In this article I have called out all those things, and I guess we should be fine. I'm just quickly scrolling to make sure, and yeah, I'm done. Now let's go to the third step, which is creating the custom connector. So we are done with our steps in Graph API and Azure Land. Here is the third step, which is create a custom connector in Power Apps environment. So for that, now let's go to Power Apps. So for Power Apps, I'm going to go to this URL, make.powerapps.com. It's loading that environment. I have put the link in my article also. Let's be a little bit patient. Okay, and I'll make it a little bit bigger also. It's more clear. Okay, so this is my Power Apps portal. It's still loading some of the other things, but meanwhile we can see the options on the left navigation. You see this data option here. When you expand this data option, you'll see different options under data, and within that you see this option called custom connectors. That's the one we'll be using. So go to custom connectors. You'll see that I have already created some custom connectors, so they will be in the list, but we have to create a new custom connector. So this is the one that I created earlier. I'll click on new. Now pay attention here, new custom connector, there are different options here. We will not go into details of each and every one of them, but when I was mentioning my earlier blog from 2017, I talked about us using Swagger file, and I had given the reference to a Swagger file that I had created. Swagger is also called Open API. So that option is this. Earlier this was the only option, and that's why I had to create my own Swagger file. But now there's a better option which I'm preferring more, is create from blank. And the reason is that at this time my Power Apps will just ask me some information and it will create the Swagger file for me, which is much better for me. Okay, so I can give name of the connector, any name that you think is good for you and your organization. I'll say graph demo, and it's okay, I think this has become too big. Okay, so it's asking for some information. Now these icons and all, they don't matter as far as technical feasibility is concerned, but for your organization you might want to have special icon for your branding. You can give a different color, put some description. I'm just leaving it as it is. I'll just keep the on-premise data gateway unchecked. We are not going to talk much about gateway, but that's another advanced and very useful concept of Power Apps. Okay, so what do you put for host? For host, and I have given this information in the article, but for host, you just say this graph.microsoft.com, and I have put that in the article so that you can copy and paste. So I'll go back to my Power Apps and I'll say graph.microsoft.com and leave rest of the fields as it is. Click next, which is security. So this is where hopefully things will start coming together for you. Right now it says no authentication. That means this custom connector doesn't need any authentication. But as you know, for using our Graph API, we do need that authentication. And the way we will use that authentication is called this auth mechanism called OAuth 2.0. Now, OAuth is a very standard industry standard authentication mechanism. If you have ever implemented sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, they all use OAuth technology. So when I see identity provider, you'll see different options here. But for our particular scenario, this Microsoft Graph API uses Azure Active Directory because that's where your organizational specific identity information is there. So you chose that. So you can see how different steps that we did earlier are being used here. Now, what is the client ID and client secret? So remember we made note of two information earlier when we were registering our app in Azure Active Directory. So here it's time to make use of those information. So client ID, let's see what is the client ID. So I'll go back to my note and I'll copy this client ID. And like I mentioned here, this client ID is something you can retrieve when you go back, just in case you forgot to make note of it. You can go back to your Azure portal, click on this app that you registered, and you will see this application ID or the client ID here. So that's okay even if you forgot to make note of. Now this one is harder. We have made note of it, so I'll go back to my notepad and copy this secret and paste it here. But if you forgot to make note of it, you go back there and you'll see that this secret you can't see. Just in case you forgot to make note of that or whatever, if you have to change it, it expired, you can always create a new secret and then make note of it. But for now, since I made note of that key, I'm not doing it. This is the login URL, just leave it as it is. Don't do anything with the tenant ID. Resource URL. Okay, so you can go back to my article and copy paste for different information, but you just have to say graph.microsoft.com. And the idea here is this: we are accessing Graph API, so this is the base URL of those Graph APIs. So that's what we are putting here, login.windows.net, because for logging in, for using the authentication, this is the URL where users come to log in. Okay, so I'm just copying this, leave the scope as it is. You don't need to do anything. Redirect URL, this will be created when we save, when we create the custom connector. Now you will notice once we create that this information will be same as what we used as the redirect URL when or URI when we uh, said redirect URI for this app registration. So go back here and I had made note of it, but just in case you were wondering where did that information come from, this information is exactly what Power Apps will generate for you. So I think at this time we can try creating connector, otherwise maybe next step. Let's see. Just waiting for this to create connector. Sometimes I think it asks you to create definition, but I'm just taking it a chance. So while it is doing it, it's actually saving the connector. Okay, so let it create and save. While it is doing it, let me talk to you about some of the things that you will do next. Next thing that you will do is, when we go to definition, is create a new action. So what does it mean, creating a new action? Creating a new action, by the way, this is created now. So creating a new action means, so far what you did, you created a custom connector and that said that this app is allowed to use the API, the Graph API, and you provided the authentication also. But when we looked at Graph API, we saw that Graph can do multiple things, like it can look at users, files, calendars, mails, identity, blah blah blah. We are looking at identity here, by the way. Now actions refer to the specific API that you will be calling. So you notice that in the Graph Explorer we said that we'll be using this API, v1 users graph.microsoft.com, but so far we have been only using information till here. So where will that be used? How will our connector know that we have to call this particular API? And that's what these actions will do for you in the next step. So click on definition, but before you that, notice that this redirect URL that is generated by Power Apps is the same that we put in our Graph API registration. So okay, so click on definition to create the action. So you see right now there is no action created here. Now these individual actions will be created for the specific API call. So in this case, v1 users that you'll be making. You're not limited to using only one action for a connector, and that's powerful. So tomorrow, if in the same connector you want to add another action, that makes use of some other API of Graph, you can just create another action for the same registered app. You just have to give additional permission for that API, but you can just keep adding actions. So in this case, let's create an action. Again, you can make the action descriptive by giving summary or whatever, but I'm just going to make it, keep it simple and say get users, and just copy the same thing. Most important thing that will matter here is the operation ID. Operation ID, as you will see when I use this connector in Power Apps, is the main method that will be used for this connector for getting the list of users. Okay, now visibility, you can learn more, but the idea high level here is that how do you want these operations information to be shown when users use it in the Power Apps connector. Okay, so now next two things that you have to do is request and response. So those who are familiar with any REST API uses, you know that this is a standard HTTP construct, request and response. So what do you put for request? Earlier in the Swagger world, I had to think about all those things and put the proper definition, but now all I will do is import from sample. How will I get the sample? So before I do that, again, going back to my Graph Explorer will help. In Graph Explorer, I see that this uses um, uh, get action, and it has this API, and these are the request headers and request body. For this API, there's no request body or header, but for some other API, there might be. So I will go back here, I'll say get. Let me copy the URL from here, and I'll leave header as it is, but for some other API you might want to copy the header if it's relevant here. And I will just say import, and you're done with request part. Now let's come to response. So I'll click on default, and here also I'll import from sample. So I'll import from sample. For this particular API, let me go back to my Graph Explorer. You'll see that response header is this. So I'm just copying this header sample, and Power Apps has the smarts in place to look at this sample and infer what kind of schema it should generate. So I'm just removing these two braces because these are the standard header information. Now request body, and here also we can put a sample. So I'll go back to my response that I got, and I'll copy the whole thing and paste that in the body. Okay, all right. So I think my computer had some problem. So I don't know what happened after I clicked on one button. So I think most of the work is saved. So I'll pick up from there. Let me start clicking on action. So I'll say new action. I talked about action earlier, so I'm not gonna repeat. Okay, so summary, I'll just say get users, because most you can put summary and description as you need for your organization. I'll put get users again, and I'll put, hopefully it copied. Okay, get users, and that's it. Now for a request, I'll say import from sample. That's where me having seen this Graph Explorer helps a lot. So I have request body and header. I'll come back here. I'll say get, because this is get, and this is the URL. I'm just using this URL. There's no header here, as you can see, for the request of this API. For some API there might be, so I'm just leaving it as it is and just click import. We are done with the request part. Let's go to response. I click on default, and here also I'm going to import from sample. So Graph Explorer is my friend here also. I'll first go to header, copy this and paste it here. I'm just going to remove these curly braces. so that Power Apps can easily parse it. And let me go back to my response. I have already seen what will that response look like. I'll come back and paste here. And that's it. I click on import, and you see that now my action, so Power Apps already processed this, and my action got these basic things. You also see that I have this validation check mark green. That means everything we did is correct, and I will update my connector now. So now we have general information, the security where we use the client ID and secret. We have the definition where we have the action, and it's saving. It says custom connector has been successfully saved. Now you can see one action here. Like I said earlier, you can keep on adding new actions also in the same connector if you want to. Now my connector, my custom connector is ready for testing. So this is the next screen, testing. For testing, I'll have to first create a connection. So I'll create new connection, and just uh, giving a pop-up which is saying some basic things that it provides a connection. I'll say okay, go ahead and create it. It will probably ask for my authentication, because now it's saying okay, using your Active Directory. So it's this time it is using my Azure Active Directory authentication to actually go and get all the permissions, establish the connection, and now I have my connection here. So you see this graph demo that I created. This is added as a connection in my Power Apps environment. So one way to test that is go back to your custom connector. This is a little bit of weird experience that Power Apps has created. Uh, that why it's not allowing me to test it then and there, but whatever. Let me go back to this connector. I'll click on edit, go back to test step. Now you see this connection that we just created is already there. I could just click test operations and see, you see 200 code here. That means it all went fine. I'm getting the header information, and I'm getting the information actually from a Graph API. This is all real information from my organization that I can now use in my Power Apps app. So far, going back to the steps, and let's go back to my article in the medium that I'm publishing. Our fourth step, we are done with this. We are done with this. We have created a custom connector. It all works fine. Our last step is to use the custom connector in the Power Apps app. So let me go back to my presentation. So we are done with okay, I'll go back to that step, and now I'm going to create the custom connector. I'm back to using the custom connector in Power Apps. So let's go back to my Power Apps environment, and you see the apps. Now you will do some basic stuff. Those who have seen my videos on basics of Power Apps, they will know what I'm doing here. Basically, I'm just going to create a new app, Canvas app, and I'll not do much anything fancy here, because goal here was to primarily show how to create a custom connector and use a Graph API, and that goal is pretty much met. But I'll still show you, although testing that connector in the environment kind of pretty much proof that it works. But just to show how to use it, I'll just create a blank app with the phone layout. And you can get very fancy here, where you can create a gallery to show everything that you're getting from your connector. But for the purpose of being quick here for this tutorial, there are many tutorials that I have created earlier, where I talk about how to use different controls in Canvas app, so I'm not going to do that. Here's my very basic plain vanilla Power Apps app, blank one. I will create, I'll just add one button control here, and on the click of this button, I'm gonna get the invoke the custom connector. But for me to use the custom connector, you see this option on the left side, which is all the data, and it has list of different environments, and it will also list the connector, custom connector. And you see these diamond icon here, that means these are premium connectors. That means your basic Power Apps plan doesn't cover it. Anyways, I'll click on this and click on this. So now this particular connector is added to your application and you can use it here. So now on this on select event of this button, I will write a very simple code, and I've also given that code in my article. So if you scroll down here, uh, this is all I'm going to do here. So go back to my app and copy this. So what it's doing, clear collect, as you know, clear collect is, and this is not the right name. Okay, so clear collect is, I changed the name, so I'm just fixing it. Okay, so clear collect, as you know, is actually for this collection. It's going to clear the previous value and put the value that graph demo dot get users gets it. By default, this also adds something called value. Uh, so I'm just saying get the value of all the users so that I straight away get the right value in the collection. And that's it. I'll quickly preview it, run it. Uh, like I said, I'm not getting any fancy here. I'll just run it and see what's happening here. Just to be sure there's no error. So there's no error. I'll go back to view, see the collections, and you'll see all users collection is populated with, in this test directory I have 2 record and it got the data. So that proves that I could create the custom connector and it's also working with the Power Apps. So that's pretty much it. It was a long tutorial. Thanks for sticking through it. If you have completed it so far, congratulations. This was great, and I'll love to see how this tutorial helped you and how did you use it in your organization, your own app. So please leave that as comment or write to us. Here are some ways uh, on how to stay in touch with us. Like I mentioned, we also publish on Medium. So look for medium.com at Cloudatica / at Cloudatica. Um, you know, if you're watching it on YouTube, you know our YouTube channel. So subscribe to it so that you keep getting these kind of articles, and let us know what topics you want us to create more video on. You can check out our website cloudatica.com or email us at hello@cloudatica.com. Happy to help you with any quick question, or if you need some kind of training or coaching or consulting, happy to help you there too. All right, so with that, we have come to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.